Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on U.S. foreign policy and global politics. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be back. We're recording this on February 25th, 2022.
On February 23rd, which is 2 days ago, Russia launched its invasion of the Ukraine. We felt it was necessary to have an emergency podcast to go over these recent developments. So, were you surprised, shocked?
Yeah, I think like a lot of the world, maybe not shocked by the action, but shocked by the scale of it and the objectives that clearly Putin has set out, and he kind of, in his long rambling diatribe, pulling in kind of Russian history and all the imperial grievances over the decades, that his intent is to overthrow the Ukrainian government and put in a puppet regime to unify and begin to reconstitute as much as possible the USSR.
Well, that's sort of what I meant. I don't think the fact that Putin put troops at all in Ukraine is what was shocking. It was the scale of it, right? So I think a lot of people, including myself, thought that he might support the separatist movement, send troops in to annex in
the
the same
Donbass
sense.
region, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But to completely invade the country, as he has, that was shocking. Even though, the military intelligence suggested that he was going to do that, I think it's still a surprise to some extent.
Even to target and attack Kiev for the idea of kind of, attacking their air support, their command and control structure in order to bring troops in exclusively to free, quote unquote, free the two areas in the Donbass region that the Duma declared as independent countries, essentially. That was expected, but the fact that, this is the full scale, full invasion, it's obviously very shocking. It's not kind of the scenarios we discussed as the most likely over the past couple of episodes. That's for sure.
Yeah. So as I have been this whole time, I was thinking, I felt like Putin wouldn't do this because I didn't see how he would gain from this. And so I've been trying to go over my thinking in what he's trying to accomplish and what he thinks he can accomplish. And it's not as illogical as I thought it was previously. When we look, we'll talk about sanctions later, when we think about the tools that the West can use to punish Russia are limited. And he probably believes correctly that they won't be permanent, that he just has to weather them for a couple of years. And what he loses is not going to be severe enough to detract from what he feels like he's gaining by putting his own government in Ukraine.
Yeah, no, I agree with the extent that the whole financial element, the punishment of that is not a deterrent. That's why kind of this argument put forth by some on the right that these sanctions should have been put in place earlier as a form of deterrent is a little ridiculous. I think the only deterrent now that exists is a military solution. And, I did want to talk a little bit on kind of what we've seen over the first couple of days. And you can't read a lot into it. Obviously, we talked about before Russia, with this 200,000 man force, a modern military, naval, air force capabilities. This is really a David and Goliath sort of situation where the full expectation, and the expectation still, is that the Russian military will overwhelm and destroy the Ukraine. It's really through kind of a protracted insurgency and resistance where the Ukraine would have a chance. But, that being said, over the past couple of days, I think been pleasantly surprised, maybe not surprised to people familiar kind of with the Ukraine. They've obviously fought 7 years in a civil war, but the resistance has been excellent overall. The Russian military, again, this isn't coming from me, but from people that follow it. We've talked about Alexander Vindman, who's currently a PhD candidate at John Hopkins SACE. He's provided some excellent analysis. And also Michael Kaufman at the CNA, I think, has provided a real great breakdown over the last 48 hours. He follows specifically Russian military activity. But the overall summation is that, the Russian military has far underperformed. Their blitzkrieg has certainly gotten bogged down in a number of areas. That being said, they are currently encircling Kyiv. It does appear that a major battle is kind of forming around there. I think President Zelensky has come off in terms of the psyops of it anyway. And certainly what his messaging has been absolutely fantastic. I mean, given that the guy was a comedian and kind of performed on a sitcom show prior to becoming a politician, he's been up front and center, kind of in fatigues in the trenches, delivering and kind of rallying the Ukrainian people around himself. And there's been a number of, frankly, heroic sort of deeds over the past couple of days. That being said, it's still a bleak and difficult situation, but I would say Ukrainian resistance has certainly looked good, looked strong, and maybe that's something that wasn't in Putin's calculus. And that ultimately, I feel like, is if he's going to pull back or fall short of his kind of goals of taking over the country, it's going to have to be there.
Right. And I was reading an article a couple of weeks ago that we maybe have talked on one of our episodes. I know the two of us talked about it. That pretty much said that the only thing that can alter Putin's calculus really is an insurgency in Ukraine. That their military could not stop Russia, but that they could make it very painful for Russia to stay and try to occupy the country. And that sort of, not only from the Ukrainian military, but also from the people willing to take arms, the citizens willing to take up arms, is certainly maybe what Putin has miscalculated. While the Ukrainian army's technology is what we thought it might be, the ability that they are going to make it very difficult for Russia to take Kiev. They can't stop Russia from taking Kiev, but they can make it difficult, is a positive sign in altering Putin's calculus on what he does next.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's the difficulty. And Russia hasn't put its full forces in the field. They haven't deployed, I think, especially the massive firepower and bombing. And I think with this sort of stiffer resistance that they've already encountered, what I've been reading is that's what we're expecting in the day ahead is just kind of massive bombing, huge civilian casualties in order to really break the back of the formal Ukrainian resistance. I mean, I think ultimately what the idea of a puppet regime and trying to manage that without a occupation, that seems insane. I mean, I think the Ukrainian people have shown the willingness to fight. So how do you do that without having a massive occupation force of hoping to keep that puppet regime in place?
Yes, exactly. Resistance was the word I was looking for before when I was talking about insurgencies. Yeah, no, I agree with you. That's the question. How do you do that? And it depends a lot on how much loss Putin feels like he can tolerate, how many bodies he can tolerate coming home, whether that is destabilizing to his leadership. A lot of people think that, the economy is not something that has ever altered Putin's regime survival, but seeing bodies come home might.
Yeah, and I think you have seen quite a few pretty sizable protests, a number of arrests within Russia itself. You saw the tennis star, forgetting his name currently, but kind of an open protest again. Yeah, Natal, kind of writing on the camera, no war. So very public kind of proclamation against the war. You saw, it wasn't the foreign minister's daughter, but it was somebody high up within Putin's inner circle who came out publicly in opposition to the war. So you're already seeing kind of these breaks within public. It's too early to read much of significance into that. And then you add on, to your point where we were talking about earlier, most of the support comes from the rural population. I would imagine most of the conscripts and soldiers are from the rural population. Yes. will body bags coming home. There's, estimates of the first day of, I think I saw on the low end, 400 casualties.
Low end was 200.
No, that was on the Ukraine side. So the British came up with a kind of an estimate of 400 up to 1,000 or so. Either way, that's huge losses for a first day where you've deployed only a third to a half of your forces.
But I think it also leads to the question of why he only deployed a third of his force and not gone into a shock and awe. And I think it's because Russians don't also want to see mass casualties of Ukrainian civilians, because there is a lot of intermarriage. Not only is there this cultural affinity, but there are families that live on both sides of the border. So they care about the Ukrainian people. I mean, they're like, our cousins are there, right? I don't know why you're giving me a skeptical face, because that's simply true.
Well, I mean, I agree that the Russian people care. I don't know if Putin and the military leadership care or not. I mean, What I've read is more, and this is from Michael Kaufman, that it's really more technical capability, that they don't have the ability necessary, one, to coordinate between kind of their Air Force, naval, and ground forces division and a coordinated attack. And two, maybe they don't have the ability for the supply chains to keep up with the full movement of the forces. And then the third reason was they're keeping these in reserves for an occupation force. So these are more reservists. What's not clear right now is whether they're using their best soldiers in this front force to carry out the offensive. If that's the case, then things aren't going terribly well if this is their best force. I mean, I think what was indicative of that is you saw, and this is featured heavily on CNN, you had a airborne assault carried out the Hostomel airport where a small group of paratroopers were put in and to seize the airfield, but they never received any reinforcements. And my understanding is that, the Ukrainians by the end of the day took that over. And trust me, the airborne guys, these are the best of the best. And the fact that they were deployed kind of in a naked way where they weren't receiving any support doesn't speak highly of the logistical capabilities of the Russian military.
Yes, I agree. But I also agree that Putin has chosen a strategy so far, like it will change if he does what you're suggesting in Kiev. But so far, he's chosen a strategy that does not have mass civilian casualties purposefully for two reasons.
Yeah, I don't think
the families, these royal families also have family ties in Ukraine.
Right.
And secondly, if you are going to have an occupation or you are going to install a puppet government, you don't want to further deepen the resistance.
Right. And I expect that will not. As they encounter more resistance in the Ukraine, as they try to take both Kharkiv and Kyiv, that they're going to resort to more mass firing, and you're just going to see much more in terms of civilian casualties.
Yes, unfortunately. I hope that doesn't happen, but yes, that does look like the trend it's going in.
So do we want to move on to the kind of the West response in terms of both the sanction program that they've put in place, and then kind of talk longer term on what additional actions potentially could come into play. But I think leading off with the sanctions, obviously all the Western leaders have kind of come up with a unified response around the sanction programs. They've released kind of details on that. Biden gave a big address yesterday detailing the targeting of kind of big Russian banks and oligarchs and their families. And I know you're currently working on an article that we'll publish shortly on the website. But do you want to detail some of what you've found so far?
Hopefully that article will be up by the time this episode is published.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's very close. I've been working very hard on it. So I think the West has been talking about what sanctions they were going to agree to for such a long time now, that it's not too surprising that they have been able to act as quickly as they have. And the sanctions do go considerably further than they did in 2014, which is not surprising to me because of it being a full-scale invasion. As I said before, I thought Putin would limit himself to Donbass area because the sanctions would be relatively light and not affect him all that much. So basically, they have froze the assets of hundreds of the oligarchs, elites, and their families so that they can't shift their wealth around through family members. And they've gone after the Russian banks, some of the largest financial institutes. Basically means freezing assets and not allowing any transactions with those banks outside of Russia. They have limited the amount of transactions, the amount of capital that they can deposit, that the oligarchs or companies can deposit in Western banks to, I think, $100,000, something like that, I was reading. But there's a big caveat to that because there is still a couple of medium level, there's still at least one bank operating that you can have financial transactions between the West and Russia, which is not surprising because that's what we'll go into. The broader industrial sectors, including oil and gas that Russia depends on, there are no sanctions on them. So, of course, you would need the ability to buy and sell assets. And so you have to have some financial capacity there. So it kind of goes to, the banks kind of go to the fact that we talked about before. You're limiting Russia's ability to access dollars and euros, which is what you pay for goods internationally. But having a nearly $600 billion in reserves already means that he has plenty of money for at least probably people estimate a couple of years to buy whatever he needs to in dollars. Plus, there's still definitely loopholes and people will find ways to access. But it does make it more difficult, and that is important at the margins. Targeting the oligarchs, that's, the one thing that's notable here is the freezing assets. Going after Putin is unusual. It's rare that they go after political leaders, although it does happen. But I don't know what ultimate difference makes. It means that the oligarchs and Putin can't access their wealth abroad in the immediate term. But those assets are not being liquidated, so they can still have access to that money in a future date. Additionally, since 2014, the investment in Western banks and other assets such as that have declined dramatically. And so the oligarchs have been reducing their risk to these kind of actions after so much of their assets were liquidated after 2014. There are ways around offshore banking accounts. There's a lot of ways to thwart a lot of these sanctions. So in this case, these sanctions do they do financial harm to these elites, but a lot of times you see in the short term the ability to not access, but there's a lot of patriotism, and I'm sure they all have figured that out. Whether you could maintain that in the long term because they can shift money through these different ways, it's difficult to see that you could make it painful enough for them to put significant pressure on Putin to change his foreign policy.
Yeah. And I think we've come across a couple of different resources, good analysis from the Panama Papers, which was a release. I can't remember if that was WikiLeaks or some other organization. No,
it was a journalist consortium.
This was journalist consortium, yeah. Again, it was all these kind of illicit transactions from global elites. But one particular detailed one of the oligarchs and their ability to move money to different shell organizations, the Treasury Department's effort in terms of shutting it down and kind of how there would be like a year delay. But ultimately, the shifting the money. I think the other thing that you'll probably cover in your article is the Russian government trying to make these favored oligarchs and their associated firms whole through direct state level support. So ultimately, they're not damaged by it. Yeah.
Right. Which again is, part of that the advantage of having that foreign exchange reserve to be able to do that, right? The reason why successful oil companies would build up that reserve, they would do it, did I say companies? I meant countries. They do that during high oil prices to weather the times that they can just put money into the economy during oil prices are low. What's kind of notable about this increase in foreign reserves is that it was during a time of very low prices. And so I have a graph that's going to be in this article and that really shows the steep incline of putting more money into the foreign reserve since 2014. And so it's clear that Putin has been strategically planning to protect himself from something since 2014. I mean, he's a very sharp and unusual incline. So part of when we target the economy is that Putin has allowed the economy to struggle at the expense of developing these reserves and his own political agenda, which has probably for a very long time included actions such as this.
Right, yeah. And speaking of kind of the energy supply, obviously a huge part of their revenue comes from oil sales. We saw oil prices spike, so the reference price of Brent crude above $100 a barrel upon the invasion. Obviously, there's no talk of economic sanctions on energy flow. On the gas side, Putin and Gazprom have kind of came out upon the invasion and guaranteed there would be no disruption within the gas supplies. In fact, you actually saw Russian imports increase a bit, the past couple of days. That being said, gas prices have surged probably about 40%. They're still below the peaks from earlier in November and December, kind of when this crisis period first arose. But that doesn't seem to be kind of the main issue.
Which is another way that buffers any harm you can do to the general economy. Yeah. I just want to say really quickly, so there's some evidence to show that when sanctions do work, they are usually the broader based sanctions squeezing an economy, but there's a lot of reasons that you could only make very modest harm to Russia's economy, even if that was important, which is unlikely to be. With oil prices as high as they are, I've seen like maybe a 1% decrease, which is not very much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's around the margins. And of course, the approach by the West, since 2014 has been around more of these smart sanctions, so targeted sanctions that aren't meant necessarily to damage the average Russian individual and their economy, but rather kind of target certain sectors or elites. I was wondering kind of what your thoughts on, because the one unique part that you didn't see in 2014. So the U.S. government announced this goal to cut off Russia's access to vital technological inputs and tried to atrophy key sectors of its industrial base, kind of undercutting its strategic ambitions to exert world influence. So I think the biggest thing around this is the production of chips that go into electronics. This is probably where it wouldn't impact them immediately, but the one part that The Economist highlighted was around the Russian data centers, which, eventually, any sort of modern military, it depends on electronic communication. But the idea would be the new rules would cut the supply of these chips, which again are made in the US and Taiwan and South Korea. So all these firms would have to confirm with that. And then I think the unique thing, unlike when the US did this in Huawei under Trump, the U.S. actually coordinated this time with all the companies and all the countries. So the thought is that it's going to be a lot less leaky than it was in the past. So over time, they replace these things a lot around the databases that in time, this infrastructure is going to start to decay. But what have you kind of read about that? What are your thoughts on the technological?
Yeah, and then I have another comment to make. Everything I've read has placed more significance on the technological sanctions, but in a way that certainly no one can quantify. So economists, and we have all these analysis of to what extent can we economically harm these actors? And we have a lot of precedents. Technology, that's I think why people are most encouraged or feel like that will have the most effect because of those reasons you stated. However, like everything, it's in the long term. So that would mean a year from now, right? There might be some pressure. Also, it's not clear to me how big of a difference if you can, at least in the short term, find inferior suppliers, but people who still supply this technology, like China and India. So I think this is something that's really, one can't really determine. The thing that Putin also very much factors in these sanctions is whether the West can maintain them long term, which I think is another thing people are more interested in the technological sanctions because that is something that's easier to maintain in the longer term. But it's not going to affect any calculus that he makes in the next 6 months on Ukraine.
Right.
Because there's still no sign that that would be a long-term consequence. And I just think it should be noted, because people don't know this, that the U.S. since 2014 has had a ban on any dual-use military technology with Russia. I think one of the reasons why I'm writing my piece, because I don't think people understand what sanctions were already in place in Russia and what the new ones are and the significance. And as I said to you earlier today, I want to write this article in a way that easily understood, because even as I'm reading all these articles about these sanctions, even in the major newspapers, it gets very technical when you think of each sanction and their effects. So that's difficult. People don't know what these sanctions are because it's also difficult to communicate the financial measures and what they mean. One point about sanctions, there's two other points I want to make, is one, popular support for sanctions often deteriorates over time, or politicians find it difficult because they do a lot of economic harm to their own economies. I still wonder if Americans would be as loud as they are about wanting sanctions if they realized that this is going to directly impact the price of food at grocery stores considerably. I'm telling you, 24% of the world's wheat supply comes from Russia and Ukraine. It's already affected food commodities prices.
Yeah, this prices drop today. I mean, I think people were relieved that certain areas weren't being targeted. I think wheat's one of them. I mean, I don't think they were really targeting agricultural.
Right. And that's the reason why we're not targeting any major...
Or energy, yeah.
Any major sector.
Yeah, I mean, Biden mentioned that up front, is he doesn't want to hurt U.S. consumers more. I mean, I think that's why it's still a very smart sanctions approach.
Well, it's very technical type sanctions, right? Yeah. Like sanctioning Russia's banks. That's a very technical financial maneuver. And sometimes because they are technical, makes it easier for them to get around them. I mean, it's hard to discuss the holes, but again, the offshore banking accounts, shell accounts that were brought up in the Panama Papers are very difficult to stop and require a lot of investigation and resources for something like the Treasury Department to stop all of them. When I was reading about China's tariffs recently, it was talking about all the U.S. companies who would then just mislabel the goods to get around the tariffs. And so that happens a lot with sanctions too. And unless you have people on the ground inspecting everything, then you have these loopholes. So then the next thing is our calls for Europe to do more. And that's a problem for Europe because they have much more financial integration with Russia. And so it's easy for us as Americans to say, oh, you must do more. But would anyone do that if they're going to send their country right back into a recession when they're struggling to recover from COVID? And certain economies definitely wouldn't be able to survive that. And the U.S. is not willing to establish any sort of fund to compensate for these losses.
Yeah, I think that's why you've seen kind of this. Obviously, there's no announcement around banning from the SWIFT financial network just because of that reason, because of the pushback from European partners who would lose considerably, and also the strategic implications of it, the fact that it may push Russia in the direction of embracing the Chinese alternative and strengthening the potential loss of dollar as the dominant reserves currency over time.
Yes, very much. So there's questions on how much harm that could actually do. If Russia's selling all this gas and oil, then people are going to have to find ways to pay Russia. And if they can't do that through SWIFT, which I'll have a brief explanation in my article as well, then they're going to find other ways to pay for that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I got a question for you. Obviously, there's been, I think, a lot of frustration. I've been following this on social media. I think this the unique thing with this war is kind of that live time feed. So there's been a lot of criticism, I think, from both sides of the spectrum on the weak response, what's perceived as a weak response from the West and the U.S. What, if you were advising President Biden, what would you recommend in terms of, over the next coming months, what additional actions to take beyond what's been announced?
I think that the financial paths, the sanction paths that they have been on are good, and they have been more restrictive. I think you put as much financial pain on them as possible while you understand yourself that the effects of that are still limited. There's only so much you can do. One thing I want to say, and I do not think that sanctions are effective at changing foreign policy. I think the academic literature is kind of divided on this, but overall, you see very little weak effects, even in places where there are effects. I still think sanctions are important, though. I think they're not mere symbolism. First, you have to take some action to say this is not okay. And if you cannot impose direct military costs on them, because I don't think, for many, many reasons, that we should go to war over Ukraine, then you have to have consequences. And so at least you do apply what consequences that you are capable of. And the other aspects are complicated, how much you can support a resistance movement, but I think you do that to the extent that you can supplies into Ukraine. But where Biden is being accused of being weak is things that you really don't want him to do, right? I mean, basically, it seems like those people are saying that we should go to war with Russia.
I have seen some of that for sure, which is kind of funny because, following this on Reddit is definitely center left overall. So seeing people then go for the adventurism. But, honestly, it's heartbreaking. I mean, we've seen the images. We've seen some really, really heroic efforts in the resistance. And to feel so impotent as an American, and so much of our, I would say before maybe 9/11 and kind of the darker period of our adventurism abroad, a lot of American national identity was almost this kind of Captain America sort of thing of how we view ourselves in World War II, of embracing freedom-loving people, of supporting them, of, seeing patriots fight for self-determination, for individual rights, for democracy, to see that and know that we can't do anything. We can't help them.
We have to deal with reality, though. I mean,
right.
That's the problem even with that narrative, is it's a narrative. It's not actually
It's a narrative, but it's a powerful part of the American mythos and mindset, which symbolism and myths and the stories we tell ourselves, I think, are important. But I think that's the impotence, that's the feeling, and I think it's just the frustration, because I think people know at their heart sanctions aren't going to stop Putin.
I mean, I think the thing is, you see people they want to take a strong stance against Russia to support. But polls have also showed that they do not want any type of military engagement, right? They don't want the military to be involved really in any way. I was on Twitter a lot in the beginning.
Yeah. And
yes, it drove me crazy, all these tweets from the right. But they didn't have a lot of actions to back them up. So, that's why they cry out SWIFT all the time. The U.S. needs to ban Russia from SWIFT. And one, I guarantee you, all those people have no idea what SWIFT actually is. And two, if they did, they would know that the U.S. cannot unilaterally do that. And three, they should know that Europe's reluctant to do so because they have so much $300 billion worth of assets in Russia. They have a lot more financial inputs into that economy that they would lose. They would have no ability to get returns on investments and such. And you're asking them to cripple their economies. And just like Biden is not going to put the type of measures that would cripple the American economy, Europe will not either. And so we always want these actions that sound good, but, again, unless the U.S. sets up a fund to compensate. So when Iran, who was already a very much smaller economic partner, was cut off from SWIFT, there were already really harsh economic consequences for European countries. And they used that example to say, how big the impact would be on their economies. Two, as we've talked before, it's not even the cost benefits of doing that don't even seem that high. I mean, beneficial, it does not seem, because again, we said that people are going to find a way to pay for oil and gas. They're still going to be giving. So, the fact that oil is priced in US dollars, which Russia has been pushing back against for decades, it would have to be redesignated in some sort of currency. So either they strengthen their own digital currency or they use the Chinese currency. It doesn't actually stop them the way people suggest it would. So basically, then you're only harming yourself in the short and long term. with maybe some small harm to Russia in the short term. But that's my frustration, is on Twitter, all these people who are, I say Twitter because I have not even watched any of the Fox and that ilk, but people who are saying, that's the most common thing. I see them yelling about those sort of things. And it's frustrating for me because they don't understand what they're talking about, but it sounds good. It's a talking point.
Yeah, I think so.
I think, again, we should take the harshest financial measures we can. We should support the resistance in the Ukrainian people as much as we can. But whatever we do, the right is going to call it weak. I mean, you have Bolton, and Bolton is saying we should have boots on the ground. Anyone who really, really is seriously saying that Biden is weak cannot make that argument without saying boots on the ground.
Yeah, and I honestly haven't seen that from any of the Republican senators who are normally fairly hawkish. They haven't. But yeah, Bolton always wants boots on the ground, so that's not too surprising. That being said, I think the smartest effort in terms of supporting the resistance and has been made before is the idea of this Lend-Lease program. And this does, of course, depend on the Ukrainian government and the resistance existing in some part of the country in which to operate. But God, if they're able to hold out in Kiev, that would probably be a miracle, one of the biggest military accomplishments, certainly in the 21st century. But even if they have to retreat and pull back to kind of a Western to leave, for instance, supplying them basically with a blank check of equipment, the most advanced military technology in order to be able to eventually push back existing
I think
ones.
we do what we can for sure. And I think, we remarked on Poland's organization of the refugees coming across this border as like something we've never seen before, recent memory, plans for refugees.
Yeah, they've done an amazing job.
We never talk about how important that is, right? We just, the people who talk about whether you're weak or strong aren't talking about reality. But things like the humanitarian aspect of this is crucial, it's critical. And the fact that we are doing everything to support the Ukrainian people through action. So these actions to take care of the refugees, have an organized sort of place for them to stay and take care of them, instead of the usual just like desperate refugees who are often sometimes held in camps in poor conditions. I think this is a really important show for the West too. I mean, I think we should always treat refugees like this, and we don't. But I think this is real action that supports Ukraine and the people.
Yeah, and that's only going to get worse. I mean, I think estimates have been only 100,000 or so that have kind of fled the country at this point, with estimates of up to 3 million, assuming that things get really rough.
And I think, though, that there's been preparation for that in Poland and Germany, although Germany hasn't shown a lot of signs of stepping up yet. But it is certainly not something that's coming as a surprise. And it's also not something that leaders are taking usual stands against migrants.
Yep.
Which have happened to Eastern Europeans before when they have come to more Western countries. There's been a lot of backlash. But I think the sense that everyone wants to support Ukraine and wants that you've seen more willingness, and hopefully you'll see Poland and Germany and those countries, and give support to even smaller countries. So I was reading like Moldova is having tens of thousands. Moldova is very, very small. And so they were calling on the EU, the rest of the EU, to give them, help and assistance because they simply don't have the capabilities to do that. So Europe needs to show up on that. The thing that always kills me about the Syria conversation is that it was always around military action. And we did so little for refugees. And that's a situation where you had millions of refugees. We could have helped that situation. The help, if we had provided it to the refugees, if we had helped Turkey and Libya have the right capabilities to take care of them.
Or Lebanon.
Yeah. Lebanon, that's what I meant. I knew that in my head as I was reflecting on it, but we didn't. We just said, oh, you guys have to take care of 1 million refugees. We're going to have this huge crisis. And that is not strategic.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. And obviously it had profound consequences in the EU and some of the domestic politics within there because of that refugee population. And
What the
issues.
right doesn't get is that humanitarian assistance is not just bleeding heart liberals. It is actually, if you want to take a completely heartless view without emotion, it is strategically one of the most important things you can do. But the things that are really useful and helpful for a situation are not seen as critical. And so if your population's not calling for it, if they're going to protest against the money that you're going to need to spend on it, which, we have no problems, spending billions for the latest, helicopter that may or not actually work. And yet we allow such small amounts for even military type humanitarian assistance is just a big strategic misstep.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I fully agree. I mean, I think it's just approaching it from kind of that purely pragmatic point of view. I mean, it's a huge part of a country's soft power, how you treat kind of a desperate population. I mean, the world looks on that and can see visually the difference between a country that embraces that embraces the least and the most vulnerable and tries to take care of them, which, obviously America hasn't always been the best at and isn't the best at domestically. But I think it says a lot about kind of the value system and that soft power that you can project.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. wants to pretend it lives in a world where it's the only superpower, but it's no longer, it's not the world policeman anymore because we've decided we're not going to be. We can't withdraw from institutions. We cannot say we're not paying these costs anymore and then expect us to be the only power that people listen to.
Yeah, so then in that power, we're in that battle for been kind of framed between autocracies and democracies. This soft power and how refugees are treated is certainly important. And I think in terms of world opinion, all the sympathy is with the Ukraine almost universally. And so I think taking care of them, supporting them in any way possible, taking care of the people that have to flee, I think is a moral and a strategically smart obligation.
Too. Like, of course, we can sit here and make a moral argument, but my arguments tend to be like, this is what I really feel emotionally. But I feel like all these, I want to emphasize that these arguments, that you can make them without support from morals
or national interest.
So you take care of the refugees while the resistance is fighting. They're not having to worry about their wives and children, right? I mean, we call it soft power, but it has a really hard power element to it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. In
it's
this
not
case,
just
it does.
about perception. And that's why I say sanctions too. We do sanctions because it's our only tool that we have, really, or the most public tool, right? I mean, obviously, we've talked about these other options that you can support, but that's why we do them. But they're not just symbols, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, because the thing we didn't mention is these refugees are primarily women and children because males age 18 to 60 are banned from leaving the country. They've essentially been kind of issued Kalashnikovs and however many rounds of ammunition to fight the Russians. So you've seen in social media all these kind of heartbreaking videos of men, saying goodbye to their wives, to their children. So yeah, you're right. It absolutely supports hard power as well to take care of those families.
And so that's something I think that's really missing in general. And even when I bring up women, there's a lot of really good work being done in feminist IR, by women and security. But I really wish there's a conversation in there that this isn't about a female perspective. This is parts of hard power that don't get discussed and have not been brought into the conversation. And the difference it makes to those people fighting to know that their wives and children and parents are being taken care of.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that was pretty in-depth coverage.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point to wrap on. Definitely my heart goes out to the Ukrainian people and to the resistance. So Godspeed to them. And obviously we'll be following this closely over the coming weeks and months.
Absolutely. If you have any questions for us or want to comment, definitely do so in the multiple venues. So as we said before, but I post on Facebook, I have these on Twitter. You can email us. We put all these links in the notes, but I want everyone to know this is something that, we want to have a conversation around. We definitely want to be able to address any questions, and hopefully I'll have some stuff to try to explain some of the sanctions and links to the more technical details that I have not been able to really flesh out.
Yep. Thanks everybody.
Bye.